He is a professor of forest ecology and silviculture at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. He also holds an NSERC Industry Research Chair in Forest Land Reclamation. He received his BSc and MSc in ecology at the University of Tübingen in Germany and a PhD in forestry at the University of Alberta. He's been involved in over 25 years of research and consulting in boreal and temperate forest ecosystems. And today he's here to talk about the role of plant species selection in the rebuilding of resilient forest ecosystems after severe disturbance.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for having me. I really appreciate talking about my favorite subject, aspen, and forest ecology. So I will get right to it because time is ticking. So yes, I will talk about severe disturbances. All right. We are all familiar with natural disturbances on the landscape. I'm coming from central Canada. I wouldn't call it quite northern, but from central Canada, and fire is one of the major disturbances in our ecosystems in the boreal. And when we talk about resilience or about ecosystems and disturbances, we generally talk about resiliency at the same time, which from some of the older definitions is really the ability of that ecosystem to recover to similar structures and functions they had before the disturbance. And that worked really well for conditions which were quite predictable as stable climate and these kind of things. So in our short lifetime as ecologists, the last 100 or 150 years or so, everything seemed relatively stable, and now we are in a time of change, and so we have to rethink some of our ideas about what resiliency actually is. So resiliency is actually in the earlier idea is a spatial and temporal variability of these ecosystems to recover. And if you look at this very simplistic model here, what you have is you have all kinds of different ecosystems, different types of ecosystems. They move around temporally from successional stages and so on. And if they get disturbed, they might be pushed out of the natural range of variability. And so the question is, how do they come back to the ecosystem type they were belonged to? Here we go. Now, I'm presenting work and ideas about the new disturbances on the landscape. Natural disturbances, the ecosystems have evolved with those for many thousands of years. In the boreal, just about maybe 10,000 to 15,000 years. But we have new disturbances on the landscape, which range from small-scale disturbances like scraping, roads, harvesting, to open pit mining, for example. And these disturbances are varying in severity and impact on the landscape. And for some of these smaller disturbances, we actually have some natural analogs. But for example, the open pit mining, the only natural analog I can come up with is maybe a crater from a meteorite hitting the ground and putting everything upside down. So that's probably the closest thing we have to a natural analog. So for these types of systems, for these types of disturbances, I think we can or must define resiliency somewhat different. And the first talk already kind of alluded to the idea, is the idea of coming after disturbance or after human intervention, do we get the same ecosystem we had before? So does the ecosystem return to the pre-disturbance state? That is one way of looking at restoration or reclamation after disturbances like these human-caused ones. Or the one I'm more familiar with and more comfortable with is to have reclaimed ecosystems that have the capacity for resilience. So these are systems which we reestablish on these heavily disturbed sites, and once something or an ecosystem has developed, does it have characteristics of a resilient ecosystem, and can it maintain either itself or can it morph into something desired? Okay? So in Alberta, this is the oil sands region, oil sands and coal mining, big factors in Alberta. There is a legal obligation to revegetate the disturbed lands to self-sustaining, locally common boreal forests. That is how it's stated in the legislature. However, there's also criteria and indicators, and those ones say that these ecosystems have to display characteristics of resilience. And that's as fuzzy as it can get, and so we have to figure out what that actually means. As we all know, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on that, forest ecosystem structure and functions are linked to variables in time and space, like landforms, hydrology, soils, vegetation, and the disturbance regimes and the climate are kind of overarching variables. The climate can be looked at different scales, at a mega scale. For example, with climate change or natural variability of climate. This is a graph here from potential evapotranspiration over a period of only about 20 years. And you can see that we have really wet years and we have very dry years and seasons, or periods of years where it is very dry. And so that change, or that natural variability is part of these ecosystems and how they have to respond. We can also look at the climate at the mesoscale, topographic positions, especially in northern latitudes where I'm coming from. The sun angle is significantly important on how much energy a slope and an aspect receives. And then we have also microscale components of the climate where surface roughness or the availability of coarse woody debris affects what can or cannot grow. Landscape forms topography, kind of the same idea. We have to be aware of these functions and how they affect the ecosystem establishment and so on. Many studies forget about where trees and plants and so on grow in. The rooting zone is a hugely important factor, and I'm just highlighting some of those things like materials and thickness, how big or how thick is the active rooting zone, what soil textures, organic contents, nutritions, and so on do we have. Are there barriers in these soils, naturally or from our management practices? And what kind of variability do we have? And that links to the topography. So the plants have a huge role in these factors and how they drive ecosystem function and service. So I'm just highlighting here quickly. These are some of the variables we have to look at in plants. We need to know something about the life history traits. We need to know stress tolerance, habitat lifespans. We need to know how they affect soil development and how they might affect hydrological cycling and of course all the interactions with those. And to make things more complicated, we as humans of course want to have some benefits out of these systems. So we have foods, refugia, nurseries, we have aesthetics, recreation, and all these good things, what we want and where plants play a role in this. We talked a little bit about recovery of species. We need to understand their asexual and sexual reproduction. Dominique already talked about aspen and aspen regeneration. How does it work with disturbance? And there are still lots of unknowns, lots of things to explore. For the grad students in here, there's lots of opportunities to do work. Pollination and dispersal. that's, I think it's one of the big unknowns. For many tree species, we know that, but for many understory species, we don't really know what the vectors are, how, first of all, how they get pollinated, and second of all, how do the seeds get dispersed for many of the forest understory species. I just had a nice discussion over the coffee break. Stress tolerance. Stress tolerance is an important driver of who can grow where. Plants have this this non-ability of moving around as individuals. Animals can run away if they don't like it. Plants have to stick it out and either survive or perish. We need to know about the life forms and lifespans. What kind of vertical structure do these species build? Not only above ground, but also below ground. This is a nice example of differences in rooting behavior between grasses and aspen. For example, these are the aspen roots, these are the grasses, and there's a reason why aspen and grasses don't really interact so well. I'm not going to go into detail of this research, but other things like coarse woody debris growth and canopy development are really important for understanding how these systems recover. Interactions. This is a cutover in northern Alberta, and this is the first year, that's the second year. Grasses are playing a huge role in our forest communities, and they are a role as an antagonist. They're not really a role in supporting forest recovery. So there's always a very tight balance between different species and how they move ecosystems through time. Soil development, nutrient carbon cycling, litter input and type. Different species have different litter input and different ways of decomposing. This is a picture of reclamation sites in the All Sands region. This is under an aspen canopy. They're the same age. Under an aspen canopy, we get about 4 or 5 inches of new organic material deposited. This is a pine stand which provides less than an inch in the same period of time. It will have huge differences on nutrient cycling and soil formation in these new sites. Work we have been doing in hydrological cycling, we haven't really understood the idea yet about what role soil water redistribution and hydraulic lift plays. We work lots with roots, and we look at root distribution along hill slopes. Aspen has this phenomenal ability to create long lateral roots, and we have evidence that water is moving uphill, contrary to all the physics. Okay. These are also some of the things we found over the years, that these are pine, regenerating pine stands, and they're high-density pine stands. They're closely linked. So they're grafted to each other. So that has impact on growth and productivity, and also on other factors in forests. So in summary, vegetation structure is really important. We need to know, and they're very, very much connected with the climate and topography. So some of the other things to make things more complicated are that we have to understand what role diversity in plant communities play. Of course, genotype selection and their interactions are really important. So now I'm coming to the real talk. That was the introduction. So how do we define now the criteria and indicators for new areas which were heavily disturbed? So we can believe that the ecosystems is in a condition that is resilient. So it will be staying there where it is, or do we have it move back to original systems? Okay, so there's two ways we can deal with this. So it either goes back within that ecosystem type, or somewhere within the variability of that ecosystem type. It can be outside, it moves to a different one, or it can be way outside of the natural range of variability. It could be completely something different. And then with that, for example, if it's in a completely in range, do we get actually a new range of natural variability? do we have to redefine our natural range of variability under, let's say, a changing climate? And I think we do. So, and we heard in the first talk about this already, there is a true challenge to talk about successful restorations. Really, the way of restoring something would be very controlled, and so things might not work out the well we want. So Cairns in 2000, he said really the most appropriate or the most restored ecosystem he has seen was right next to assemblages which were natural systems. But we really don't know where it's going to go. So when you have reclamation areas where you really start from scratch, these are our systems where we know we have starting conditions, and it's pretty much like primary succession. And we can develop landscapes where the climate, for example, plays an intricate role in how this system develops. So after we develop topographical and hydrological conditions on a landscape, then we just put a cover on it and either plant things, we manage it, or we let things just happen. So now, what we can do in order to develop this is use species and genotypes appropriate for these climates which we have right now, or can we actually tinker with the system and think ahead and apply system or introduce systems which might grow there in a different future. So after I was pretty much focused on this part, restore plant communities, matching species to sites, also what quality of planting stock do we put on these sites, what tree species we select, and also what understories we have developed. Whoa, come on, go back. Here we go. So selecting the species for resiliency, as I mentioned already, we need to understand the ecology, and we need to hedge our bets. We already talked about that. We need to weigh our options. Can we build an ecosystem where they come and come on their own? Do we have to help every species to get there? So resiliency will change in time, or can change in time, and with the disturbance types. We already talked about history of disturbances. So are there possibility of alternate states of ecosystems? And will there be different outcomes? And will there be success or failures? So different outcomes. The type of disturbance will play a huge role in the resiliency of these new novel ecosystems. What time did this disturbance occur? The age of the ecosystems. The resiliency changes in time. Young stands have a different resiliency than older stands, and especially if you have managed stands or stands you try to restore. Okay? Species presence, seedbank, and so on at the time of disturbance will play a huge role, and of course, what developmental stage a site in the soil is in. So you can get all kinds of different outcomes. This is Wagner and Zazada for natural forest ecosystems, but really I think it applies very well to managed and restored ones too. So that lets me to make the connection with aspen. Well, aspen is very much used in reclamation of these sites, and the question is aspen a keystone or foundation species? And I think this is something we have to think about in how we restore and how we use aspen in the restoration of forests. So aspen, the epitome of resiliency. We heard about the root system. It is a very strong species in the sense of how it can respond to disturbances. Dominique nicely showed aspen seems to be a winner for most parts of the fight with disturbances and even with climate change. Aspen is really a weed, although we don't want to say, but it has characteristics of a weed. The seed production and seed dispersal of that species is phenomenal. You know, this is pictures from Alaska. This is aspen seed on a forest floor. This is aspen and poplar seeds along riverways, and they go everywhere. So that is the strategy of aspen, is flood the area with seeds. Okay? However, the seeds are the Achilles heel of aspen. They are very sensitive to what can grow where. This is an example of different substrate types, and Dominique and I should talk about his wind throw and so on, why aspen might or might not grow. Maybe he has a lot of seedlings actually in some of his wind thrown sites. The substrate is really important, what you get. See, these are organic. There's some mineral organic mixtures. Here is just subsoil, and this is the worst of all the soils, for example, nutrition and carbon-wise. Where do they establish? You need microsites. Concave microsites kind of make sense because they select moisture and so on. Can we produce seedlings which have a wide range of quality? Can we plant different ones? Here's initial root carbohydrates. We can produce seedlings which range in 20% to 40% carbohydrate content in the root system, which we know is a good thing to grow and to survive in landscapes on unstressed sites. The other thing is we can nutrient load aspen. We can give them the tools in order to survive. We really talked about this already. The root system is what makes aspen resilient. And now my question is it a foolproof system? Well, there's lots of factors which can affect the root system negatively. I've done many, many years of research on how bad root systems can be affected. There can be below ground and above ground herbivory, defoliation, and so on are huge factors in this. So the last thing I want to talk about is how I think some of these things work. This is young aspen tree or a clone which was produced by cutting trees and having them resucker, and then manage how much leaf area these things produce. What we found is if they had less leaf area for the root system, they did lose significant portions of the root system. So the roots, what you see yellow is live roots, what is black is dead roots. So we found really nice correlations between leaf area and the amount of reserves in the roots. So carbon, and there I say it, carbon starvation in some of these stress situations might play a significant role in this. This is another significant relationship between leaf area and the root mass, how much root mass you actually have left. So aspen is very much dependent on its leaf area. So if we get drought, for example, dying back the above ground portion of the mature stand is probably a mechanism for survival, because the root system does not necessarily die, and it will resprout with less leaf area. Okay, and so that system might survive. So I'm thinking I'm pretty much almost out of time here. So depending on what we plant and what we get and how well these things grow, if we get a healthy root system, we might get the stands we want or ecosystems we want. We might not, though. If things are not working well, we might get to a different stage, which is dominated by grasses or non-tree. It might happen in the middle of the boreal forest. We don't know that yet. So, conclusions. It's a complex system to restore ecosystems, especially if you want to look at resilience. We have to think about this. Resiliency is not a given. We might fail. New ecosystems, as a result of the changing conditions, like climate change, will develop. We will have prairies in reclamation systems. So I want to leave it at that. Thank you for listening, and thanks for a whole bunch of people who supported my research over the years. Whoa. Okay. I stunned you all, I went too fast. Oh, there.
Simon, I was a little surprised, or maybe I missed it, that you left out some work you did a few years ago about seed spreading to new areas where aspen was not established in the relationship between climate. Maybe you could just quickly review that.
Thank you.
And how
I wish I
that
had an hour
relates
to talk. Yeah, don't we all? But yeah, no, we have seen a significant movement of aspen uphill into the Rocky Mountains as a result of human disturbances. So one of the drivers, and that's the reason why I showed that substrate stuff, because it is truly, truly important for aspen to have the right soil conditions in order to spread. So what we have seen is especially after harvesting and site preparation, we get up to 1,000 to 1,200 stems per hectare of aspen seedlings in these higher elevations, which is 300, 400, 500 meters higher than where it was originally. And the climate is just fine for aspen there. And 1,200 stems per hectare give you an aspen forest, especially after the second disturbance. So my interpretation of that is that the lower foothills of the boreal forest is actually moving up, because the pine and the spruce are going to be with them, co-dominant with the aspen. They grow up all co-dominant. Once the next fire goes through, there's going to be aspen-dominated stands, and maybe our upper foothills will look like Colorado in the next 100 years or so. It's going pretty quick. I'm amazed how fast it moves.
One more question?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Over the years, I've heard conjecture that aspen root systems might be able to lie dormant without much support from above ground leaf area. I'm intrigued by your research. It seems to show that kind of what you see above ground is indicative of the health underground. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I completely agree. There is no such thing as a bud bank in aspen beyond. If there's no leaf area, we have tons of research under logging decks and stuff like that. After, especially when the soils are warm and there's no suckering happening, that root system can be dead within 1 year. And storage of roots in just piles of soil and so on is very, very poor. You lose most of those propagules within 1 year. Yeah.
All right.